name is Matt Wilson. I'm with the Alabama Small Business Development Center Network, and I often speak to groups all around the state, and I get to say that over and over again. So we just shorten it to SBDC, but that's what the SBDC stands for, Small Business Development Center. And I'll tell you a little bit before we sort of dive into what we're going to be talking about with entity formation and operation and things of that nature. I'll tell you a little bit about our organization and what we do. As we all can probably relate to, small businesses in general have all of these different things that they have to worry about, to think through, whether that's marketing, which we're all here today to talk primarily about that. But what products and services are we going to offer? What is the marketplace that we're operating in? What does that look like? What are the legal issues involved? All of these different things. And so what we try to do, and I'll explain exactly who we are in just one second, is to be sort of that one-stop shop in a way to help small business owners, managers, entrepreneurs sort of work through these processes and these issues to get a better understanding and a clear approach to what they need to do and how they need to go about accomplishing their goals. As I mentioned, we are the Alabama SBDC network. We are a state-level SBA, Small Business Administration resource partner. We're going to hear from our friends at the Small Business Administration here in just a little while. But our primary goal is to work with small businesses on the state level to promote economic development and small business development in order to, as an economic driver for the state of Alabama. We work under a cooperative agreement with the SBA, so part of our funding comes from the federal government, part of our funding comes from the state government, and our goal is to provide one-on-one business counseling services and consulting, and informational services. I often tell people we're sort of the information gatherers for small businesses as they're dealing with all of these issues, so that they are well informed to make a decision as they're working through many different things. The way it's set up in Alabama, like most states, is the University of Alabama is actually our host institution, and then we have sub-centers throughout the state, including the Auburn SBDC here at Auburn University, as well as these other institutions around the state, as well as an office at the Innovation Depot in Birmingham. Encompassing our program overall, we do sort of run the gambit, as it were, when it comes to different things, as I said a few minutes ago. But our sort of three major sub-programs, as it were, is the Capital Access Program, finding financing for clients, the Alabama International Trade Center that works with import-export, and then government contracting with PTAC, the Procurement Technical Assistance Center program. So those are all housed within our network, as it were. What I'm really going to speak on today is business entities. What is that vehicle for your business, whether that's aquaculture, whether that's anything else? But what is that business vehicle that is going to help facilitate your business? And just want to go through a few things. I'm primarily going to talk about the bottom half of what you see here, limited liability companies, LLCs, and corporations. But I did want to sort of walk through the basic legal structures as they exist in Alabama. As you can see, we do have sort of four primary business vehicles, as it were. The top half are unlimited liability, and we'll talk about what that means in just a few moments. And the bottom half is limited liability, and once again, we'll talk about that in a few moments. With a sole proprietorship, this is your basic, one-man show, one-woman show, one-person show, as it were. Basically, by law, it's one person going into business for themselves, whether that's setting up a shop, whether that's setting up a food cart, going to a farmer's market. Sometimes licenses, and typically that's the case. Sometimes business licenses are needed. Sometimes it may be a professional that has some sort of license in and of itself. Most of the time, though, businesses will need a business license. There are some pros and cons to sole proprietorships. There is unlimited liability, which means you personally, if something were to go wrong or happen, you personally can be sued and your personal assets can be potentially at jeopardy. So it's something to think about. Even if you do have insurance or things of that nature, they can still try to go after your personal assets. So I often say when you're dealing with the public in general, it's better to have some sort of liability shield in place through another sort of entity, and we'll, like I said, go into that in a few more minutes. There are some tax and financial considerations. It is akin to a pass-through, which means everything sort of flows through your personal tax return. So you can easily commingle your personal and business assets, which may be an advantage depending on your type of business, but there are a lot of other considerations. And of course, it's sort of ease and flexibility of operations as well as the legal issues that sort of encompass that. Partnerships are basically a sole proprietorship, except you're going into business with someone else. So by definition, a partnership is two or more people going into business for themselves. A lot of the same issues with sole proprietorships come up with partnerships. There are some issues related to tax planning and financial considerations. You still have that unlimited liability issue. But there's also a great deal of flexibility with operations, so something to think about as well. Now we're going to go sort of into the meat of what I really am going to talk about, and just want to sort of very quickly overview these. The great thing about a limited liability company is sort of the flexibility, but also having that limited liability. We'll talk a little bit more about the operation and some of the tax and financial considerations in a moment, but just wanted to introduce the concept. Same thing with corporations. This is the most complex legal structure, complex business vehicle, business entity. There's a lot of formality to it. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But it also sort of gives you the utmost of a limited liability protection and can protect assets, even though there are some major tax and financial considerations and things of that nature, as well as some operational issues that would need to be discussed. So with that said, we're going to dive into sort of the meat. As I mentioned, that to me, especially when dealing with small businesses, there are only two different types of entities, particular entities that are more formal that need to be addressed, and that's limited liability companies, which we're going to talk about now, as well as corporations. But there's a specific type of corporation. It's more of a tax selection than it is anything else, and I'll explain that in a few moments, but we'll dive into the concept of a limited liability company. Basically, a limited liability company sort of merges the liability protection of a corporation with the flexibility of having a sole proprietorship or a partnership. It is the most flexible business vehicle, in my opinion. There are some basic formalities that you have to go through, some hoops to register with the state. The big issues with formation are you basically start out with a name reservation, which reserves your name for a limited amount of time in order to make sure that, A, there's not a duplication at this point in the game, a duplication of a name for marketing and branding purposes, if nothing else, but also legal considerations. So you start out with the name reservation, and then you fill out your certificate of formation, as it's called, as a term of art, and you find a registered agent. And I did want to point this out on the registered agent front, because I get this question quite often. A lot of people are confused about exactly what a registered agent is, and some people think that they have to hire an attorney to be it, or they have to, to hire a company who's a registered agent, and that's not the case. Many of my clients, and of course I deal with clients who are a mom and pop shop to fairly sophisticated, a lot of the microbreweries in the state, so fairly sophisticated organization. So sort of run the spectrum when it comes to small businesses. But anybody of legal age in Alabama can be a registered agent. The more complex of an entity, yes, you might want to get your attorney involved or think about someone. But a registered agent is basically that person who is going to be there for service of process, and service of process can mean sadly, if someone did get sued, where those papers would be sent to. But it also means the sort of the official documentation from the state, whether that's the Department of Revenue, whether that's the Secretary of State, things of that nature. But I get that question quite often because they think they have to hire somebody to be a registered agent, and that's not necessarily the case, especially if it's a small business and startup. The flexibility of an LLC allows people to inexpensively get into business, and so I try to emphasize sort of that flexibility approach, but making sure that you do follow the rules, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. Even though it's a creature of state statute, limited liabilities they're formed by the authority of the state government, the legislature through their enabling acts. They're actually, the paperwork is actually filed at the judge of probate in the county in which the business is located. So, for instance, if it was here in Auburn, it would be with the Lee County Judge of Probate. Or if it was in Birmingham, it would be with the Jefferson County Judge of Probate or the Shelby County Judge of Probate, depending on what part of town they were in. So you can mail it directly to the Secretary of State. However, I highly recommend you don't do that, because then it will get lost in the mail, and Lord only knows what will happen then. It's easier just to take it down to the courthouse and file it, and you're basically in business at that point. And of course, after you go through this process, it's often, even though a single member LLC doesn't necessarily have to get a tax ID, an employee identification number, I highly recommend it to avoid using a personal Social Security number for a business purpose, especially because you want to keep everything distinct, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. You want to keep everything distinct between your personal and your business life, as it were. And then, of course, as I mentioned a few moments ago, any appropriate business licenses that are necessary. Typically, that's a county state license that's dual. It's issued at the county level in Alabama, but also if you're in a particular municipality, there may be a separate city license that you have to get as well. So exploring, and that's part of what we do, but exploring what licenses are necessary is something to be mindful of as you're thinking about potentially forming an LLC. As far as operation goes, that's sort of the next step after formation, sort of that first post-formation requirement, is filing the business privilege tax, which is, for most small businesses, typically only $100. Once you start getting larger, it's based on revenue and some other factors. But most small businesses pay $100 for the initial and then $100 a year thereafter. That's a filing with the State Department of Revenue, and then it's an annual filing, as I mentioned, thereafter. Within LLCs, as I mentioned, they are sort of this flexible hybrid of the limited liability of a corporation with the flexibility of a partnership. But the people involved with an LLC are called members, and that's once again a term of art. So the membership of the LLC, whether that's a single member or whether that's a multi-member, that's what they're defined as instead of a business partner, even though you may refer to someone as your business partner. But the official name, as it were, of the individuals or entities involved in an LLC are called members. Although not required and not necessarily, does not have to be filed with the state, it is highly advisable, especially in a multi-member LLC, to have an operating agreement. And this is the same thing as a partnership agreement. It basically spells out the rights and obligations and duties, whether that's capital, whether that's talking about money, or whether that's talking about management, things of that nature. But it spells out all those rights and duties and requirements and things of that nature when it comes to actually operating the business. And it's extremely advisable to have one if you have a multi-member LLC, 2 or more people in business together. I often deal with family LLCs too, and I was once upon a time involved in a family LLC, and we definitely needed an operating agreement because we definitely did not get along. So highly advisable even in that situation to have an operating agreement. I have a client, it's two young ladies who own a fitness studio, and they're best friends, been best friends forever. They will probably be best friends the rest of their life, but I made sure that they had an operating agreement just in case something went south. So definitely highly advisable on that front. As I mentioned earlier with the sole proprietorships and the partnerships, it is a pass-through entity. So what that means is that, once again, your business income, revenue, losses, business expenses, all those things flow through your personal tax return to what's referred to as a Schedule C, which I'm not an accountant. I know enough about taxes to be dangerous, so I'm not going to delve into that. But that's something to consider, and it can be advantageous depending on your business, the nature of your business. Highly recommend that anybody thinking about forming an LLC, develop a relationship with an accountant so they understand what that means for their personal tax situation. But there can be some major advantages to having sort of that pass-through entity and being able to write off business expenses, things of that nature, with some limitations, of course. But I would definitely defer to an accountant, and I'm happy to get anybody any information that they need on that. But some things to consider in sort of the operational aspects of your business vehicle of forming an LLC. So what are the advantages of an LLC? I've alluded to some of these. Obviously, the limited liability for members, it protects your personal assets, even though you can still get sued. A lot of people, I get that question a lot because they think, okay, well, I'm going to form this LLC, so I'm invincible. Even if, I won't get sued. Yes, a business owner is probably, sadly, going to get sued at some point. It just helps protect your personal assets. The important aspect of that is to follow all the rules. Yes, LLCs are less formal than corporations, which we'll talk about in a few moments. But you do have to make sure that you keep your personal and your business assets separate, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a few moments. Once again, the major advantage of an LLC is sort of that flexibility and the ability to sort of agree, as long as it's not illegal or void as to public policy or something of that nature. You can sort of agree how you're going to share the profits. Yes, that's going to be an issue as far as tax considerations go, because each member of the LLC will have you have to take that into account as their pro rata share sort of flows through their personal tax return, but it's that flexibility that makes LLCs so attractive. And then also, because of that, once again, that flexibility of an LLC versus a corporation, there is less formality and less record keeping. Yes, there are some record keeping requirements, and of course for tax purposes and all sorts of other reasons, and just out of general principle, it's best to keep some pretty detailed records for business purposes. But there's not required annual reports. That used to be the case in Alabama, but the current statute eliminates that. And they're actually about to redo the LLC statute, so some of this will probably be void in 5 minutes. No, I'm kidding. There is a new statute coming. It won't affect most business owners, but it'll affect their lawyers, that's for sure, and probably my job as well. But there is that less formality and record-keeping aspect. So it's once again this concept of flexibility that makes LLCs extremely attractive as a business vehicle, especially at startup. And that's what I often recommend for clients when they're talking about, I sort of need to get this business up and running and off the ground. What's the best option? And I often recommend LLCs because of the flexibility, the ease of formation, the relative inexpense of it, because you can then sort of take it to the next level, as it were, when that point comes. But especially to get a business off the ground, LLCs, that flexibility aspect really makes LLCs attractive for small businesses, especially. So what are some of the disadvantages? Well, there are certain limitations. Even though an LLC it does exist in perpetuity, so it does sort of last. The thing is, if one of the members dies and you don't have an operating agreement in place, it sort of makes things really, really, really messy. And so that's another reason why you should have an operating agreement, to spell out what happens when a member dies, because of it's not easily transferable. That's for sure. You can't just pass it on to your child or pass it on to your spouse if you were to pass away. There's some statutory limitations to that, but you can also spell out exactly buyout provisions, things of that nature in an operating agreement, or just sort of, even if you're a single member LLC, just having some sort of working business planning document, strategic planning document that spells that out. Because if you're a single member LLC and you die, which I know is morbid, I don't mean to be so morbid, but if something were to happen, the LLC would cease to exist and there would be business assets. It just sort of makes things a little messy. So there are some limitations to it, but there are some ways around that. We'll get to the alter ego doctrine in a moment, because that's extremely important. I alluded to that in a few moments ago. But a major disadvantage is the concept of self-employment taxes. Those of us that are employed, we know when we get our paycheck or things of that nature, we see all the withholding taxes and the what I call entitlement withdrawals as far as Social Security, Medicare, all that kind of thing, because you're withdrawing half of it, but your employer is paying half of that. When you're self-employed, you have to pay 100% of that, and your tax rate can go up quite substantially. I know I've been self-employed before. I hated writing those checks at the end of the year when April 15th came around. That's a major consideration, especially when you're a small business owner, is that yes, there are these advantages for taxes as far as pass-through and getting to write things off and business expense deductions and things of that nature, but your tax rate is probably going to go up. And there are some ways around that, but it is a disadvantage for many members of an LLC, many small business owners. But I did want to talk about the alter ego doctrine, and this is going back to what I was speaking on a few moments ago with the need to keep your business and personal assets separate. If for some reason say for instance sadly someone got sued, I would hate for that to happen, but we all know it happens every day. If a court were looking at a case, for instance, and this is also applicable on the tax side of things. If they were sort of seeing your business vehicle, your LLC, being used almost as like a personal piggy bank, and you were going to Walmart and using your business debit card to buy personal groceries, then that could cause a major issue. What they call pierce the corporate veil, pierce the LLC veil, pierce that liability shield. And in that case, you open yourself up personally to a lot more liability, and so it sort of defeats the purpose of having an LLC, that liability shield in place. And so they've come up with this term, the alter ego doctrine, meaning that if you're sort of using the LLC as, once again, your personal piggy bank, a court or someone who's suing you, or the IRS, whomever that may be, can sort of come after you and have some, you could find yourself in a heap of trouble. Let's put it that way. So just something to consider. I always encourage, you definitely need a business checking account, but I just encourage all of my clients, particularly that are setting up an LLC, to keep everything as separate as possible. I often get the question about single-member LLCs, and I actually was posed this the other day by a client of mine saying, basically there's no point in having a single-member LLC because you don't have a liability shield. That's not necessarily the case. I am of the opinion that is not true, and I have conferred with several top attorneys in the state that are working on this new LLC statute, and they concur with me. There are a couple of cases where someone used an LLC sort of as their personal piggy bank, but more importantly, to hide some assets during a bankruptcy. And so the court came in and said, no, you're just using that to shelter these assets while you're going through bankruptcy. And so the court itself actually sort of pierced that veil, as it were, and came after the person individually. I'm of the opinion, though, and my colleagues, the attorneys, they concur with me, that if you follow the rules, you follow the formalities set out by the statute when it comes to LLC, and keep everything separate, basically, then your liability will be, your liability shield, as it were, will remain intact. There are some nuances to that, and I'm happy to address any particular questions, but I do get that question often. It's come up lately quite a bit, and so that's my opinion. I've studied the topic. I've conferred with attorneys, and they agree with me. So we'll be interested to see how that develops, especially if this new statute comes into play. So that's a little bit about LLCs. Let's talk about corporations. And I mentioned corporations a few moments ago. And what I particularly want to focus on are S corporations. And I will explain what that is in a moment. There are two types of corporations. There is a C corporation and an S corporation. A C corporation is basically and the reason for the letters is because it's subchapter C of the Internal Revenue Code and subchapter S of the Internal Revenue Code. So that's where those acronyms come from, or those designations, as it were. But C corporations are basically, the easiest way I describe it to small business owners is it's what you think of as a corporation, like a big, the GEs of the world and things of that nature. Typically they're public. There are many private C corporations, especially family-owned corporations. But for small businesses in particular, I want to focus on S corporations, and I'm happy to address any questions as it relates to C corporations. But just to focus in on sort of my specialty with small businesses, I wanted to focus on S corporations. As you can see, the formation process is very similar to LLCs because that's pretty much the case. You pretty much follow the exact same steps, including the business privilege tax. All businesses in Alabama have to file that, both initially and annually. But it's basically you go through the same process. Name reservation, you file your certificate of formation with the judge of probate in the county where the corporation is situated. Its primary place of business, as it were. You get your tax ID, your EIN, you get your appropriate business licenses, and then you're up and running. So the formation aspect of it is a little bit, well, price-wise, it's about the same, and I'm happy it's different in every county. That's why I have not talked about price, but happy to help anybody with that if they have questions. But price-wise, it's about the same, and from an organizational perspective, formation at least, it's pretty much sort of the same process and relatively easy to do. However, and we'll talk about this in just a moment, with the increased formalities of a corporation, it's definitely better to get an attorney involved at the outset because there are going to be some additional filings and things of that nature to consider. That flexibility that I mentioned with LLCs is not quite there when it comes to corporations due to the formalities. So we'll definitely talk about that. Corporations in general are the most complex entity, as I alluded to. There is a requirement by law to have boards of directors, annual meetings. There are formal filings, annual filings that have to be filed both with the Department of Revenue and Secretary of State. You do have to, even if you're a one-person stockholder of an S corporation, you do have to issue stock. There has to be what's called the subscription for capital stock. But what makes S corporations different from C corporations is you avoid double taxation. Probably several years ago, this was very prevalent in the news, and so probably everybody sort of heard about this concept of double taxation. Basically, the C corporation itself is taxed as an entity. And then once you're issued dividends, if you have capital gains from the stock increase or loss, what have you, then that's taxed as well. So if you're a business person who has a C corporation, you're going to be taxed twice. That's the short story of what happens. The great thing about S corporations is it takes an election with the IRS under the Internal Revenue Code to be a pass-through entity, which is a lot like an LLC and a partnership where everything still gets to flow through your personal tax return. And then there's some nuances to that, and I definitely would encourage anybody who's interested in forming an S corporation to, once again, consult an attorney, but also consult an accountant to take advantage of those, or to better understand those tax advantages. But that's what makes the distinction between a C corporation and an S corporation prevalent, as it were. There are some major advantages, and sort of going back to the tax considerations and the pass-through nature. It does give you the most limited liability, and I will say that I do feel like it gives you the most limited liability that you can have. There's a trade-off, though, obviously, with those formalities and having to have a board of directors and having to do the annual meetings and all these things that are required by law. And obviously, but with the pass-through perspective, there are the tax benefits. There are, being able to write off business expenses and, being able to sort of mitigate maybe some other income that you might have. So there are some major tax advantages. Also, it is a separate legal entity, and it's easily transferable. You issue stock, so unlike an LLC, where the membership has to agree if you can pass it on to somebody else if somebody dies or somebody leaves or what have you, you can sell your stock, and that's advantageous, especially if you're in business with several other people. So you do get that separateness combined with the limited liability and some tax benefits that are accompanied with limited liability companies, but it's readily transferable. So that can make it attractive depending on what type of business that you're in. And there are some nuances to that. But there are some major advantages to having an S corporation. What are the disadvantages, though? Once again, going back to some things that we've alluded to already, is these formalities that are required by law. There are stricter operating procedures, not only prescribed by statute, but also some the tax code, not only the Alabama statute, but the IRC, the Internal Revenue Code, and as well as some Department of Revenue rulings for that matter. The trade-off too, though, on having that pass-through nature that I've talked about and having those tax benefits is that you are required by law and by the Internal Revenue Code, which is regulatory, is the fact that you do have to, all shareholders have to be paid a reasonable compensation. Reasonable compensation, and that sounds extremely vague because it is. That depends on your industry and your marketplace and things of that nature. But the point of that is the IRS and the state departments of revenue want to see that you're not just passing things through the entity, that they want to get their tax cut somewhere. Let's put it that way. So death and taxes. What can we say? But there is the requirement for what is quote unquote reasonable compensation for all shareholders in an S corporation. This is typically not an issue with small businesses because by the nature of a small business, even though a small business is many times defined as 500 employees or less, depending on what industry they're in. An S corporation is limited to only 100 stockholders, and there are some limitations on the type of activities that they can undertake as well. So those are some disadvantages to S corporations. But overall, those are sort of the two main components of different business vehicles, different business entities. Happy to address any questions at this time as far as if anyone here in the room or at our remote locations have as it pertains to business entities. And also I encourage you to visit our website as you see here on the screen, asbdc.org. There's a wealth of information. You can register for free. Our services are free because we are in the business of economic development. So I'm not trying to sell anybody anything. I'm just trying to help. I'm here from the government and here to help, right? So, but definitely give us a call anywhere in the state. You can dial this direct number. It goes to our main office, and then an appropriate counselor in that area will be able to be dispatched to speak with you about your specific needs. As I mentioned, we do sort of cater our services to individual businesses. Because no small business is alike. Everyone's a little bit different. But definitely, regardless, I would encourage you to visit our website. We're happy to assist any small business owners in any way that they can. But otherwise, I'm happy to address any questions.